Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to this December 11th, 2013 edition of Nightcast. Tonight, the big story around the world, and one that we who take diligent notice of the state of our flock in the way of world news. That means we diligently watch what's going on around the world. The body of Nelson Mandela has arrived at the main government building today in Pretoria, where it will lie in state for 3 days. Mandela's coffin, draped in the South African flag, was taken in procession from a hospital mortuary to the Union Building. And we'll have video showing you a couple of different angles on the procession. It was taken to the Union Building, where family members, politicians, and members of the public paid their respects. Andrew Harding reports from Pretoria.
An early morning convoy through the streets of Pretoria. Nelson Mandela's coffin carried into the city where he was once sentenced to life in prison, and on towards the building he later came to occupy as president. And so to the elegant Union Buildings, once the seat of white apartheid rule. Mandela's grandson, Mandla, presides. The heavy coffin, draped in the South African flag, is carried to a wooden structure in the courtyard. Among the first to pay their respects, Mandela's ex-wife, Winnie. The extended family now halfway through a draining week of official events.
I think he would have been completely humbled by it, to see so many people just share their love, their appreciation, just the sense of inspiration that he has given them.
Then come the politicians, including the former apartheid leader F.W. de Klerk, who shared a Nobel Prize with Mandela.
I hope that his focus on lasting reconciliation will live and will bloom in South Africa.
But today's politicians have a tough act to follow. South Africa's President Jacob Zuma was booed yesterday in front of the world's leaders. A sign, even on a week like this, of the frustrations boiling in Mandela's Rainbow Nation. On the streets outside, the public queue for their chance to pay their respects. I've just been to view Nelson Mandela's body along with some of the first members of the public. The mood inside, very dignified, very somber. The lines filing past his coffin very quickly. People allowed a second or two to stop and pay their respects. And there is that immediate shock of seeing that instantly recognizable face. For many here, it seems the reality has sunk in today.
I wanted to see the body, for me just to get over it and accept it that is really gone.
When we entered there, I was shaking, and then when I saw the casket, I was crying.
Then it's time for the coffin to return to a military hospital for the night. There will be 2 more days for the public to come and say their goodbyes in person. Andrew Harding, BBC News, Pretoria.
Okay, thank you, Andrew Harding. And we have another piece of video that shows as his remains were transported through the streets of the city, people lining the route to form a guard of honor. Friends, I thought there might be some commentary with this piece of video, but this is just raw footage of the body being transported through the streets. We'll stay with this for another half minute or so here. Very significant event for many, many people, thousands and thousands of whom have a great respect for their leader in South Africa, their former leader in South Africa, his body being laid to rest. Now I have some more video, just one or two more videos on this. Again, this one with... I believe this one will be with Andrew Harding once again, who's been describing the moment he paid his respects to a peaceful Mr. Mandela.
The VIPs have now been in to see Nelson Mandela's body, and this is a queue for the public and some journalists out in the hot sun here outside the Union buildings. I've just been inside with the public to see Nelson Mandela's body. It's lying in basically a wooden arch covered with some white material. It's a very somber, very dignified atmosphere inside. Lots of security, a lot of members of the armed forces here as well. It's a very brief experience. The lines divide into two and file either side of the coffin. The upper part of that is covered in glass, and it's a shock to see that instantly recognizable face of Nelson Mandela lying very peacefully there with two honor guards with swords standing at his feet. You get about a second and a half, maybe two, to see him, to pay your respects, and then to move on. A lot of people afterwards here telling me how shocking it was to see him lying there, and for many, of course, after the celebrations that have been here, that the sense of joy and celebrating his life, it's, I think, for many people a moment of bringing them down to earth, back down to reality, to finally understand that a man who is so honoured, so respected here really is dead.
And now, friends, all didn't go extremely 100% well. There is a story from today where deaf viewers of Nelson Mandela's memorial service have complained that the official sign language interpreter was inept. Questions are now being raised about who he really was after the Deaf Federation of South Africa said the signs made no sense at all. Will Ross reports from Johannesburg.
The depths of his empathy.
He was one of the busiest men on the planet. No, not Barack Obama, the man next to him doing the sign language, interpreting the speeches at the memorial ceremony for Nelson Mandela. He did it for hours. But deaf people started complaining over the internet that they were missing out. The chair of the Deaf Society of South Africa came in with his female interpreter to tell me what he made of the ceremony.
No, I'm not getting anything. No, he's showing some gesture, but it doesn't have meaning. I don't know what this means.
So together we watched one of Nelson Mandela's grandchildren deliver a praise poem.
It's a poem, isn't it? So there should be facial expressions. There's even no facial expression.
The government says it's aware of the complaints, but hasn't finished investigating, as it says it's busy with the state funeral. Embarrassingly, South Africa's President Jacob Zuma was jeered by some in the stadium. But now there are allegations in the local media that the state broadcaster did its best to edit out the booing. Along with the hand signals saga, some awkward questions may need answering. Many people had hoped that there'd be plenty of singing and dancing to celebrate the life of Nelson Mandela. They weren't really ready for all those long speeches at the ceremony. But the bigger headache now for the South African government, which organised the event, is to explain how on earth this man got the job as an interpreter. Watching a clip from local TV, it's clear the two interpreters are on a completely different page. An extraordinary case of lost in translation. Will Ross, BBC News, Johannesburg.
Well, that's actually some sad commentary. I have always admired when I would see the sign language interpreters in the Ambassador Auditorium in Pasadena and standing up front, and for those that were seated in rows who were deaf, they could watch the interpreter, and, you know, sometimes I would get a lot more out of a sermon by watching the sign language interpreter, and sometimes the hand signs would be enough that, I don't know how to do that, so I'm just juggling or whatever here, but sometimes when I would watch it in the auditorium, I was just mentioning when the sign language people would do this during a sermon, I would get more out of the sermon sometimes by watching over there, and though I couldn't understand everything they did with their hands, sometimes I got an idea that, oh yeah, a little bit more than what I was hearing. And the facial expressions, you know, it helped keep you awake too. Now, I'm not saying there were some that put you to sleep, but I guess I am saying that there were some that could put you to sleep. That always happens, you know. It depends on how late you were up the night before and things like that, too. Okay, Steve, get yourself out of that one. All right, now, friends, let's go on. Let's go to Ukraine next. Police in Ukraine have abandoned attempts to clear anti-government protesters from the capital, Kiev. Violence erupted at the occupied city hall hours after riot police tried to clear nearby Independence Square. Now the protesters have reinforced the barricades and refused to move. Daniel Sanford is in Kiev and reports from there.
All evening, men have been streaming into Kiev's Independence Square, carrying sandbags full of snow to build up the fortifications. Rather than allowing the freezing weather to dampen their protest, they're using it to their advantage. And thousands were on the square again tonight to show their support for the pro-Europe rebellion.
The European Union, it's not just geography, it's rules. It's that if I'm working hard, I can have some futures.
The barricades are being built by protesters fighting to keep alive their dream of joining the European Union, struggling against being sucked further into Russia's sphere of influence. Earlier, protesters used freezing water to hose down riot police trying to reclaim Kiev's city hall. But the real battle happened overnight. Hundreds of officers had tried to storm the protest camp, which has closed Kiev's main street and shut it down. For hours, a sea of police pushed against an unmovable wall of demonstrators, but couldn't break through without using violence, something they'd clearly been ordered not to do. The European Union Foreign Policy Chief, Catherine Ashton, who was in Kiev, condemned the police action and welcomed their retreat.
I've seen that there's been withdrawal today, and I really do hope that is an indication that the government realises it does need to move to dialogue.
Tonight, the president who triggered the crisis by pulling out of the agreement with Europe said he was ready to talk to the opposition and made this promise.
I assure you that the government will act in the framework of the law and will never use force against peaceful rallies.
On the square, they just want the president to resign. They don't speak for all of Ukraine, but they are determined and are proving formidable opponents. Daniel Sanford, BBC News, Kiev.
Thank you, Daniel. And we've got some video, an excerpt now for you, friends, from Hard Talk. The Russian Federation Council's Mikhail Margelov, now not Mikhail Gorbachev, but Mikhail Margelov, a senator in Russia, has told BBC Hard Talk Russia's economic relationship with Ukraine is pragmatic. asked about reports of Russian officials placing heavy pressure on Ukraine to sign a trade deal with the European Union, Senator Margelov said they were only trying to point out how interdependent Ukraine's economy is with those of other former Soviet countries, and that they could help Ukraine overcome its economic problems. Since late November, thousands of pro-EU Ukrainians have been protesting in Kiev over the government's decision not to sign the partnership deal with the EU, and these protesters have been calling for the president and the government to resign. You can watch the full interview. We're just showing you a little excerpt of it here, but you can watch the full interview on BBC World News today at 4:30 and 21:30 Greenwich Mean Time. And if you have access to it on the BBC News channel at 30 past midnight, after midnight tonight. And here's the excerpt we have for you from Hard Talk.
We know from things that Russian officials have said that heavy pressure was put on Ukraine not to sign the deal with the EU and to embrace a deal with Russia. Are you denying that?
No, we were just trying to bring our message across to our Ukrainian friends, saying that, okay, you have Ukrainian economy interdependent with the former Soviet economies of CIS countries and countries of the customs union, and we can count how Russian economy, how Kazakh economy, even Belarusian economy can help you to overcome your economic problems and your financial crisis.
But with respect, Mr. Margelov, this wasn't just about friendly discussion of economic benefits. Let me quote to you words from Sergei Glasiev, a senior Kremlin advisor, whom I saw at a conference in Yalta in Ukraine in September, say this. He said association with the EU would violate Ukraine's treaty on strategic partnership and friendship with Russia. In that case, Russia could no longer guarantee Ukraine's status as a state. That's what he said.
Well, I cannot comment on every statement made by every Russian bureaucrat.
That was pure bullying, wasn't it? That was a threat to Ukraine. If you go down the European route, you will pay. You will pay in terms of your relationship with Moscow.
No doubt. Anyone pays for any economic alliance. UK paid a lot becoming member of the European Union, as I understand, and is still paying. And for Russia Federation, it's a very pragmatic case, our economic relations with Ukraine, as well as...
Is it pragmatic? Is it pragmatic when the signal is sent through the course of the summer that Russia is capable of placing punitive tariffs and sanctions on Ukraine for no more than political reasons?
At the same time, Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev was saying very openly and clearly that to join that alliance or not to join that alliance, it's a sovereign decision of the Ukrainian government.
It's a sovereign decision, but by the way, we're going to blackmail you in the meantime.
But any decision costs something.
But what is Russia so frightened of?
I don't think that Russia is frightened. Russian economy is very much dependent on former economies of former Soviet republics. And, for example, when we talk about our defense industry, I think that between 20 to 30% of the military production of the Russian Federation is very heavily interdependent to the suppliers from Ukraine. And that is not the only segment of economy which we care about.
Okay, friend, there is the excerpt we had for you from Hard Talk to show you Russia speaking on whatever influence it may or may not have had, pragmatically or otherwise, regarding what's happening in the Ukraine. And we're watching that because that relates potentially to how the EU will eventually shape up or shape down to wind up being 5 countries from the east, 5 countries from the west. East and west, they don't get along, but for a short time they'll combine and give their power to one, as person, the one leader the Bible calls a beast. He'll be an emperor crowned out of Frankfurt, Germany. Most likely will be an Assyrian emperor again, not a Frankish emperor. Most likely. Of course, we have to wait and see, but that's where things are headed. And if we were to put our chart up on the screen, let's do that for just a moment before we go to the next story. I want to make mention of the fourth seal. If you count over 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, you see the number 4 at the top of the fourth column. And in that column, you see a pale green color and the word pale. And we've got that to indicate that the fourth seal of Revelation is depicted by a pale horse whose rider is named Death. And this rider, Death, named Death, and that horse, the pale green horse, they ride alongside them rides Hades, hell, the grave. And Jesus Christ described the particular activities of this horse with Greek terms that the gospel writers wrote up in 3 different Greek terms. They wrote it up as loimos, meaning disease epidemics, pestilence, the plagues of Egypt, seismus, meaning seismic activity, commotions in the air such as gale force winds of all kinds, commotions on the ground such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and tsunamis and wildfires and floods, etc. And the third term that the gospel writer Mark wrote up for Jesus Christ's plain language description of this fourth seal of Revelation, the pale horse with the rider named Death, was tarake or tarake, a Greek word meaning troubled waters, both literally and figuratively. And it also, as the Greek English lexicons explain, it also means mobs, seditions, and that kind of thing. And the troubled waters that can be either literal or figuratively can mean situations in a country when it's having economic woes, economic problems. When a marriage between a man and a wife, between a legitimate marriage according to the Bible, God's Word, problems can exist or accrue or come up or be especially painful, lead to divorce many times when the money is tight and there's just not enough money to pay all the bills. And when there's not enough money for a country to do that, even the United States is suffering that somewhat, but it can lead to the kind of strife that leads to civil war. It can lead to war between that country and another country. When people, why, the Bible asks in James, why wars? And then it goes on between you, and it goes on to explain that, do they come not from your lust and desire to have, but you have not because you ask not. You just want to go and take it away from someone else. So when a country's having economic struggles, that's the climate for war and for world war, because the country having the struggles will see another country that's, hey, they've got something we could use and would like to have, and we're bigger than they are, got more bombs than they do, and we're going to go take it from them. And so wars come out of economic problems. So we keep an eye out when there's economic distress. We also keep an eye out when that fourth seal, let's put it back up, the chart back up on the screen for a moment, that fourth seal, if you can read those words down below where it says plagues, it also was described in plain language by Jesus Christ with the term loimos, which means, we went over that. I went over that with you a moment ago, but I'm going back to it because I was describing tarake for a moment, troubled waters. But this next news story we're going to cover is related to that first thing Jesus Christ described, the loimos, the disease epidemics. And that's the point in this next story. Tuberculosis has often been described as a ticking time bomb, and now the potentially deadly lung disease has become resistant to many of the drugs used to treat it. Now, friends, I know that many of you who watch this program have faith and trust, put your trust in the great God for your healing. And I'll say thumbs up to you on that. If you've got the faith, terrific. That's the best way to go. But the point of this news story that's going to talk about a disease that is now resistant to drugs that used to treat it, for those that go with the medical world and drug treatment. The point is, this disease has gotten so destructive that what the medical world used to be able to do to treat against it, they can't do anymore. The World Health Organization says almost 500,000 people around the globe were diagnosed with the drug-resistant TB last year. And that's the point I want you to get out of this. Not the drugs or anything else like that, but just the point that 500,000 people were diagnosed with a disease that's gotten so destructive that it's now drug-resistant. Tulip Manzumder reports from Mumbai.
Dharavi, Mumbai, one of the world's biggest slums. Through the cramped, narrow streets, we come to meet Ranju. Her 23-year-old daughter Bharati died of TB earlier this year. Her mother is now also infected.
My daughter was as beautiful as a flower, but slowly, she wasted away. I remember her always. But what is the use of thinking about someone who is no more?
Ranju says her daughter wasn't given the full course of treatment when she first developed TB, and that made her resistant to the two main types of TB drugs. Her mother is also sick. She has an even deadlier form of TB called pre-extensively drug-resistant TB. It means even more drugs don't work on her. These claustrophobic, dark, damp streets create the perfect environment for TB to spread rapidly. It's hot, humid and crammed full of people. More than 1 million people live in this square mile alone, breathing in each other's air, increasing the risk of infection. Many patients who aren't getting the right treatment in government schemes end up here. This clinic is run by a medical charity. Doctors here say they're seeing more people infected with drug-resistant TB. Normal TB medicines cost around $50 in developing countries, but resistance builds when people don't take the full course. That gives people multi-drug resistant TB. It affected some 450,000 people around the world in 2012 and can only be treated with stronger, more expensive drugs. Even more difficult to treat is extensively drug-resistant TB. It can cost many thousands of dollars. There were around 45,000 cases globally last year. Now there are even reports of totally drug-resistant TB. The World Health Organization says most people who are resistant aren't diagnosed and could be spreading these much deadlier strains.
This is exactly what we see in our current practice. Patients die despite providing the best treatment right now, because maybe the drugs just don't work.
Back in the slum, Ranju is hopeful her mother will survive. The government says it's trying to improve diagnoses and get more people on the right treatment sooner. But Ranju knows looking after her mother puts her whole family at risk of catching this increasingly deadly disease.
And friends, with that mention of the young lady there taking care of her mother as she tries to do, I want to say a big salute to one of our Facebook fans for the Nightcast Facebook page, Jan, who takes care of her mother in Oregon. And I'm just going to mention her first name, but I'm sure Jan would appreciate your prayers that God will help her stay strong and be able to continue to do what she's doing for her mother, and even do some lifting up of her mother, help her mother be stronger. That's all the time we have for the program tonight, friends. Thank you for joining me on this Wednesday evening edition of Nightcast. God willing and the creek don't rise, we'll be back again tomorrow, Thursday night, for our next edition of news related to the Bible and prophecy here on Nightcast. Until then, this is your host, Stephen Lloyd, saying, so long, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.